Hello and welcome to All Generations. Today we're talking about the silent generation. I feel the silent generation is less known and talked about because it is a smaller, older, and possibly more silent generation. Did you know some of them were born before the chocolate chip cookie was invented? Yum! So let's learn about this lesser known generation. I'll be covering lots of topics. If you want to check out a specific topic, then you can click one of the timestamps down below. If not, it'd be cool if you watch the whole video. Regardless, on this channel, I cover different topics relating to the generations and over time topics. So if you're interested in stuff like that, feel free to subscribe and hit the bell to get notifications. So let's get to it. What is the silent generation? The silent generation is a generation between the greatest generation and the baby boomers. So why silent? People began using the term silent generation in the late 1940s and early 1950s. FYI, I'm about to hit you with a bunch of quotes in this section. A 1951 Time article called People, the Younger Generation, said, "The most startling fact about the younger generation is its silence. With some rare exceptions, youth is nowhere near the rostrum. By comparison with the flaming youth of their fathers and mothers, today's generation is a still small flame. It does not issue manifestos, make speeches, or carry posters. It has been called the silent generation." A couple years earlier is when we first saw the idea of this silent generation. In 1949, Fortune magazine came out with a story on the college class of 1949 called Taking No Chances. It described the class as so tractable and harmonious as to be incapable 20 or 30 years hence of making provocative decisions, and also criticized them for taking no chances and having a gray flannel mentality. Basically, they were saying the generation was afraid to speak up or take risks and preferred to simply blend in. It does seem like a bit of a contrast to how we think of people today, and allegedly a contrast to their parents and seemingly children as well. I do need to know some things though. The Fortune magazine story was referring to those graduating college in 1949. With a normal 4 years in college, that would have put them probably born 1926, 1927. Sometimes those people fall into the greatest generation, depends on which years you use. Anyone who took longer than those 4 years would have also been possibly and probably, depending on the years you use, in the greatest generation. And I would guess that there are more members that would have been in the generation just because of that timing. This is, 4 years after World War II ended, which is when some people would have came back, and some of those people may have gone to college and they could have been starting at a variety of ages. And so I just think that's good to keep in mind, that really what they are talking about here is sort of late greatest, early silent, cusp area. It's still where we get the name from though. Another obvious idea you can garner from this is that someone always wants to criticize either the young people or just the generations they perceive as different from their own. In this case, maybe it's not as bad as others. Anyway, after those pieces came out, more people took a hold of this idea. In the 1950s, historian William Manchester, a member of the previous generation, described the young people as withdrawn, cautious, unimaginative, indifferent, unadventurous, silent. And it seems even some people who claim membership to the generation agreed. In a 1970 Time essay, The Silent Generation Revisited, the author says, "We were, with a few exceptions, still quiet and serenely uninvolved." Note that I think the person who wrote that was also in that cusp area. Now, when you see anything talking about silent generation characteristics, including, the silent generation as we know them today, most of them do tend to describe them in the same manner. Cautious, playing by the rules, afraid to rock the boat. They're also thought to be civic-minded, traditional, and hardworking. They tend to be thrifty, and apparently like to appreciate the little things. Now, before I get into why some members at least may have been silent, let's address the fact that not all of them were, obviously. Not everyone fits the stereotypes of their generation. Martin Luther King, Cesar Chavez, and Gloria Steinem are all silents who made waves. Also, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a silent. The people who put together Woodstock were silents. And maybe some silents aren't so silent either. Let me know if you think the stereotype is correct or not, whether you're a silent or if you know one. So, for those who were silent, where did the silence and cautiousness come from? It could be a few things. During their childhood, the prominent mentality was that children were to be seen, not heard. Especially if adults were around, children were to keep quiet and know their place. An example, in some households, adults would eat dinner first. Obedience was more important than curiosity. What is it? Just eat it. This idea may have carried through with them later in life, where they might have been afraid to question authority. Of course, it also probably worked well for them in the hierarchical structures they would find in the workplace. Still, basically all of this would have been true of the greatest generation as well, and to a lesser extent, people that came after them. So let's look at some other possible factors. Going in a different direction, one reason they may be perceived as silent is because they're a smaller generation. There are less of them. This is similar to what we see with Gen X, where they're sandwiched between two bigger generations, and they can get lost in the mix because of the overpowering, like boomers, for example. And they're actually smaller than Gen X because during the Great Depression and World War II, people weren't really wanting to have a lot of kids. Which, speaking of, some people cite simply being children of the Great Depression and World War II as reasons for their disposition. Growing up in a time of instability could certainly contribute to them being afraid to rock the boat and jeopardize their success, which they did end up having, but I'll get to that later. In the US, growing up or coming of age during McCarthyism / the Second Red Scare is also commonly cited as a reason they are silent. For those who aren't familiar with the term, I'll try and explain it a little more in a bit, but first the Merriam-Webster definition. A mid-20th century political attitude characterized chiefly by opposition to elements held to be subversive and by the use of tactics involving personal attacks on individuals by means of widely publicized indiscriminate allegations, especially on the basis of unsubstantiated charges. Broadly, defamation of character or reputation through such tactics. The word McCarthyism originates with Senator Joseph McCarthy, who basically went around everywhere looking for communists and accusing people of being communists. Now, sweetie, share the cookie with your brother. That grandma's a communist. Lock her up. What? So this was going on, and yes, that was a bit of an exaggeration, or at least I hope it was, in the late 1940s and through the 50s. So during these times, silence would have been ranging from young children to their early 30s, so many were coming of age during this time. Before I get into more about them, I just want to touch on what birth years people typically include as a silent generation birth years. As always, well, usually it depends on where you look. I'm just going to hit on a few. Pew uses 1928 to 1945. Howe and Strauss used 1925 to 1942. Australia's McCrindle Research says 1925 to 1945. British think tank The Resolution Foundation uses 1926 to 1945. And I've also seen plenty more, including just like before 1945 for those who don't want to look at generations before the silent generation. I'm torn myself. On the one hand, I like to just use pew years to make things simpler and be consistent. But on the other hand, it seems like a lot of the other sources start the years earlier. Plus, a lot of the original ideas around the silence actually are being applied to people who were born in those earlier years. One reason I do still like the 1928 year, though, is it makes it more so it was just the greatest generation / the G.I. generation serving in World War II, and that if someone from the silent was serving in it, it would have been because they were falsifying their age. So it would have made it so just those who were 18 and older. A personal example, my grandfather's brother, my great uncle, served in World War II. He was born in 1926. He technically did join at 17. That was the year he turned 18. And it was the year before the war ended, so you see how this happens. So the other would make it simpler. And speaking of him, he was fortunate enough age to serve in Korean War and Vietnam as well. Now let's talk about some of the events the silent generation would have experienced in early life to young adulthood-ish. Starting with the Great Depression. Few silents would have been born before the Great Depression started, and quite a few weren't born until after it ended, but that doesn't mean it didn't have an impact. History.com says, the Great Depression was the worst economic downturn in the history of the industrialized world, lasting from 1929 to 1939. Fun fact, my great-grandma, an early silent, was born on October 28th, 1929, the day before Black Tuesday, which is the day the stock market crashed. She tells me about only eating broth and occasionally bread for a lot of her childhood. Now, while some silents weren't alive during this period, their parents were, and would probably have gotten some cautiousness, necessary thriftiness, and probably a strong work ethic that they would then pass on to them. The Dust Bowl was an event that was around the same time. It was an environmental disaster which caused hundreds of thousands of Americans and Canadians living in the prairies to flee to other areas. In the US, that was mostly California. You had a lot of Oklahomans going to California. But with the Great Depression going on, still few found better conditions. And the Dust Bowl ended as the Great Depression did. So obviously, this is when World War II began. And before you say the silents had it rough, yes, but remember that their parents, the greatest generation, were also kids or adults during the Great Depression, and then they were old enough to be drafted into World War II. Plus, some silents hadn't even been born at the start of the war. Even though I don't want to heavily cover events that some of the generation wouldn't have experienced, some of these events are so big they provide context for the time they were alive in. Some may have lost family members in that war or subsequent wars. This was also obviously the time of the Holocaust. An example of another silent you may know from this time is Anne Frank. She went into hiding in 1942 at the age of 13. On that note, I should probably also mention the Japanese internment camps in the US, which were going on around the same time. In 1945, the world's first atomic bomb dropped. The first nuclear explosion actually occurred earlier that year as well in a place I ended up living 50 years later. And guys, this stuff is Bad for your health. Anyway, this was also sort of the start of the arms race with the Soviet Union. After the war, the baby boomers started being born, and there are a lot of other various things that happened due to the war ending, including the Philippines becoming independent, just as an example. In 1947, the Cold War between the Western and Eastern blocs began. Silents were aged around 2 to late teens or early 20s, depending on the year you use. Many of the major world events from now on are at the broader level, kind of between the US and the Soviet Union / the USSR. And this was a battle with their ideologies, their power, including their weapons and military, as well as their achievements. The domino theory was influential at this time. That's the idea that if one country becomes communist, that others in the region will follow, like a domino. This is when the US saw the Second Red Scare / McCarthyism, which we talked about earlier in the Why the Silent Generation is Silent section. Now, in 1949, the Soviet Union tested an atomic bomb themselves. In 1950, the Korean War began. I'm just going to say that some silents would have served in this war. Some of them would have been old enough to serve, though others were still children. It lasted until 1953, and the events leading up to this and the outcome of the war obviously shaped the countries today. On October 4th, 1957, the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik, launched. This was a pretty big deal, not just because of the technology, but also because of the rivalry I mentioned earlier. The space race was on, and this was the beginning of the space age. When the Soviet Union got Sputnik out, Eisenhower was like, I am creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, otherwise known as NASA, immediately. And you know the rest. Space exploration of any kind was huge and very new, so it would have been super exciting to everyone watching. The 1950s were a key time for the silents as a whole, with ages ranging between 5 and early 30s over the decade. And so far we've discussed there's the Cold War, the Korean War, the launch of Sputnik, the space race, but there was more. 1955 was the start of the Vietnam War, though the US wasn't immediately involved. Feel free to comment if you are watching from another country so I can keep that in mind in future videos. I'd like to know where my viewers are from. By the time the US was in Vietnam in the mid-60s, all silents would have been adults, and at this point, so were early boomers. Over 2 million were drafted. Some protested involvement, especially on college campuses, and that would have been a mix of late silents, early boomers, and in fact, that's also probably a lot of the mix of who was serving as well. The way the draft worked actually changed during this time, though, so it just depends on at what period. When the Vietnam veterans returned, many did not feel a warm welcome and instead felt they were returning to a country that was torn apart. It was the aftermath of the Vietnam War that caused Congress to create the Vet Center program and recognize post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. Now, going back to the 50s, this was also the time of the civil rights movement in the US. Brown versus Board of Education declared segregation of public schools illegal in 1954. The Montgomery bus boycott was the following year. The March on Washington was in 1963. So we're moving into the 60s now as well, of course. This is when MLK gave his I Have a Dream speech. Then there was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, outlawing discrimination based on sex, race, color, religion, or national origin. Well, in 1966, Cesar Chavez did his Long March in California, and there was more. White flight. And this is a migration of white people who were in areas that were becoming more ethnically and racially diverse, and that was in the 1950s and 60s. Often it meant moving from the cities to the suburbs. Jumping to the 60s more, again when the silents were around 15 to the early 40s. 1960 was the JFK versus Nixon election. Most, but not all, silents were eligible to vote. I'm mentioning this because it was a close election in terms of the popular vote. JFK, who won, America's first Catholic president, which apparently was a cause of concern for some. He was also one of the youngest presidents. 1961 was the year the Berlin Wall went up and the Bay of Pigs invasion occurred. The Cuban Missile Crisis was in 1962. This is yet another US-Soviet Union Cold War thing. Then we have the JFK and MLK assassinations, and if silents are still perceived as silent today, maybe one could argue that seeing those assassinations could have impacted them as well. Also during this time, second wave feminism began, and we had the start of the gay rights movement in the US, with Stonewall occurring in the late 1960s, but we're really getting into boomer territory now. Now let's touch on some other technological and other life changes for the silent generation, both compared to the previous generations and during their life. The silent generation grew up in a time before microwaves were in households and before copiers were in offices, or at least before they were common. When the youngest silents were born, the Slinky was newly on the market, and Velcro was decades from being widely used. Scotch tape was new. The instant camera came out, but wasn't yet popular, and Monopoly made its debut in 1935. This generation experienced some big changes. While they had already been around, phones were becoming more common. My great-grandma, the 1929 one, told me that when she was a kid, so I guess probably in the 1930s or 40s, the first telephone came to town. And she said people would come from all over town to check it out, and she would climb something and watch them. Not sure what was going on. Radio was a big part of life for many in the 1930s, and they would sit around the radio listening to stories. Onto cars/automobiles, this is a big topic. When the first silents were born, automobiles had only recently become more common, and traffic lights were pretty new and not very widespread. The car/automobile changed a lot in society, and the car itself also changed a lot over time. But in general, it gave people more freedom, including young people, in areas like dating. Teenagers gained a big interest in the freedom that was allowed by cars. By the 1950s, washing machines and frozen food were becoming more common. The television introduced another huge change to life. While it was invented earlier, the TV wasn't initially marketed to consumers and didn't become popular in homes until the 1950s, when the youngest silents were in school and the oldest were in their 20s or maybe early 30s by the end of the 50s. The number of American households with a television went up significantly from 1950 to 1960. Earliest silents would have gone through most of their childhood and possibly all of it without a TV. The number of TV stations also went up. Popular shows included things like I Love Lucy, Leave It to Beaver, and The Twilight Zone. Can you imagine life before all the screens we have now? No TVs, no computers, no cell phones. That was life for many silents growing up. Cake mixes hit the shelf in the late 1940s and so became more common in the 50s. The late 1950s saw more inventions ranging from the microchip to Barbie, if you can call that an invention. In the early 60s, the first cassettes came out. Dishwasher was also out but didn't become popular until later when the silents were all in adulthood. So that was our earlier life. How has the silent generation adapted to the more recent technology of today? In 2019, Pew found that only 40% of silents aged 74 to 91 at the time owned smartphones, compared to 93% of millennials, 90% of Xers, and 68% of boomers. The older members may have trouble seeing the small numbers and letters, and some of them may be in homes. At the same time, that 40% number was up 10% from the previous year, so it looks like they're really getting on to adopting these technologies. In the same year, 2019, nearly a third owned a tablet computer, and 28% reported that they used social media, and both of those were on the upward swing as well. Fun fact, while they had assistants, I have Zoomed multiple relatives in their 90s, too.
Anyway, so far I got $24 in quarters.
So that is pretty cool. Who is the oldest person you have Zoomed with? How old were they? Just curious. Comment below. Now, moving on to some other topics. Family and relationships. Typically, the parents of the silent generation were the greatest/G.I. generation. Marriage and children came early for both of these generations. Plus, that was a longer generation, so it just makes sense. But some, of course, could have come from before. The parents of the silent generation would have experienced both the Roaring 20s and then also the Great Depression, World War II. And many would have struggled to provide for their children following the economic crisis. So as was the case with their parents, it was normal for the silents to marry and have children early, with most of them marrying around their early 20s, some of them before that. Thus, dating in high school could be considered pretty serious. This is one reason the silents are also called traditionalists. They were following the footsteps of their parents, hitting these milestones early, and in some cases earlier than their parents. For their children, silents would generally have given birth to a mix of boomers and Xers. So obviously, if they were among the first silents and had kids early, it could have been another silent, or if they are on the later end, they could have given birth to early millennials. On to education. When silents were 25 to 37, 30% had not completed high school, 13% completed some college, and 15% made it to a bachelor's degree or higher. And due to the time, the percentage skews more male for completing more education. For the earlier silents especially, some would have gone to segregated schools. There was also a transition away from the one-room schoolhouse. Automobile technology is part of what changed schools. Because buses could now transport kids a farther distance, schools began to separate more. And so now we had high schools with a bunch of teenagers in one place, separated from the younger kids, which probably reinforced the youth culture, which I'll talk about in a bit. Education itself also allegedly changed, making it more practical and involving more fun/projects and things. On to work. In 1938, the U.S. passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which prohibited those under the age of 14 from working in most industries and put restrictions on hours and hazardous work. So most of the silence would have been protected under this, though it did not apply to farm work. The act also allowed workers to earn overtime if they worked more than 44 hours. Now, when they were all adults in 1963, the Equal Pay Act was passed to make it illegal to pay some workers less based solely on sex, though for the first decade it did not apply to certain types of work either. There were other acts passed as well, all generally to make improvements to the workplace. When they became workers as adults, the companies often provided good benefits. Unions were strong during this time, but non-union companies would try and incentivize their employees by offering things so they would not unionize. Silents were typically loyal employees and expected that from their work as well. At least this is what is said. As you know, higher education wasn't common and wasn't frequently required. And also, by the time they entered the adult workforce, were pretty reliable, unemployment was low, and they could afford, it seems, to survive on one income. Women were to take care of the family, while men were to be in the workplace. Silence did see women enter the workforce, though, particularly in World War II, though they were then expected to return home. And those who did enter the workforce often saw the inequalities between both sex and race. So even when women were in the workplace or racial minorities were in the workplace, they were often separate from the white man. Additionally, just the way it worked, promotions and salary increases tended to come with time at the company. So on a similar note, I also wanted to briefly talk about finances. This generation has sometimes been called the lucky few due to their timing, and a book had that name. That's part of where it comes from. Which, by the way, I said that, they were also called the traditionalists, some used the veterans, etc., but usually no one is interested in those other names, so I'm not going to go into that more. Anyway, generational writer Neil Howe wrote an interesting and long article in Forbes about silence, which covers some financial topics regarding this generation. He talks about that idea about many of them getting lucky timing-wise. When they graduated high school, there was a good economy waiting for them, and they even had better earnings abilities at a young age than people who were older than them at times, than their parents. Plus, like I said, unemployment was low. Though, of course, again, we have to acknowledge that the opportunities were not 100% equal. Many got good interest rates on houses before inflation hit, and they also got defined pension plans. And then, due to their smaller size, things like Social Security and Medicare have been less of an issue. Plus, since most all by Howe's birth years would have hit 65 by 2007, most had likely moved their investments to a more conservative state. He said cashed out, but I'm sure it varies. But it was quite an interesting article. But yeah, I want to mention, individual circumstances play a role in it. And I mentioned this earlier, but just since we're on this topic, they did tend to be thrifty. And just another note, houses were much smaller back then. I saw a reference to the National Home Builders Association that said the average home in the 1950s was less than half the size of the average new home that was being built in 2019. Now I just wanted to touch on a few other fun, cultural type topics like music and dance. While youth culture started a little earlier, the idea of teenagers actually didn't become more of a thing until around the 50s, at least how we think of it today. And the teenagers of the 50s would have been nearly all silent. So how did they enjoy that time? Some would have gone to the cinema or a sports game. Sports was becoming more popular, like sports things. This is when malls and shopping centers started to come about. Another activity I mentioned earlier was listening to the radio, and I also read about this thing where on Sundays when things were shut down, they would dress up and go walk around town hoping to catch the eye of someone they were interested in. Now, music was a big part of this time too. Post-World War II was the beginning of rock and roll. The war was over and these kids were ready to have a good time. The jukebox was one way some young and probably old too people enjoyed listening to music. During this time, white Americans also began to have more exposure to Black cultural influences. Some popular musicians included Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Frank Sinatra, and Elvis. The dance hall also grew in the 1940s. Live music and soft drinks were a part of this. Popular dances at this time included swing dancing, the twist, the boogie, the bop, the jitterbug, the bunny hop, and more. For being called the silent generation, it sure sounds like they were having a lot of fun dancing. The 1950s is also when the transistor radio came out, which was a new way to listen to music. When the hippie movement came along, it was a mix of silents and boomers. For example, if you look at the members of the Grateful Dead, they are a mix of late silents and early boomers. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you got this far, please give this video a thumbs up, and obviously subscribe if you haven't, if you want to see more videos. And I will see you next time. Communist. Sharing a cookie?